All right, so today we're diving into a story you probably haven't heard before. It's a murder that happened on September 11th, 2001. Yeah, that's September 11th. But this one took place miles away from the towers in Brooklyn. It's about a Polish immigrant, Henrik Sevak. He was found shot that night, and his case is still unsolved to this day.
You know what's really fascinating about this case? It kind of shows how 9/11 impacted everything, even seemingly unrelated events. Like, here's a guy, came to America for a better life, and his story almost gets lost because of what happened that day.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sources we have for this deep dive are amazing. We're hearing from Henrik's sister, Lucina Shivak. She was living in New York at the time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and her perspective is just, it's so personal, so raw. You really feel what she went through, and you get a sense of who Henrik was as a person.
It's incredible how those firsthand accounts can bring a story to life.
For sure. And then to get the bigger picture, we also have two retired NYPD detectives, Mike Prate and Tommy Joyce.
Oh, right. I've heard of them.
Yeah, they were actually working on 9/11, so they help us understand just how chaotic that day was and how that chaos might have affected the investigation into Henrik's murder.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like for them.
So Henrik Sevak, he comes to America, right? Wants to make a better life for his family back in Poland, sending every dollar he earned back home to build a house for his wife and kids.
Wow. That's
Right.
dedication.
Right. And apparently he was a skilled craftsman, like really good with his hands,
Yeah.
just completely dedicated to his family.
That detail about sending every dollar back home,
Mhm.
that's powerful. It really shows the sacrifices immigrants often make, putting their own needs aside to build a future for their loved ones.
It's heartbreaking, especially knowing what happened to him.
Yeah.
And there's this, well, it's almost spooky. Lucina told this story about Henrik having a premonition about his death.
Really?
Yeah. Just days before 9/11, he told her he felt like he wasn't going to live much longer. And before leaving Poland, he even told his son that it would be the last time he saw him.
That sends chills down your spine. Makes you wonder about those gut feelings we get sometimes.
I know, right? It adds this whole other layer to the mystery.
It does. But from a psychological perspective, it's also interesting to think about how those premonitions might have been influenced by the stress and uncertainty of his life. Being an immigrant, working so hard, being away from his family, all that takes a toll.
Yeah, I bet. And then, 9/11 happens. Can you imagine trying to investigate a murder in the middle of
I
that?
can't even fathom it.
Detectives Prate and Joyce, they described it as absolute chaos. Cities in lockdown, resources are stretched thin, everyone's on edge. It's just...
It makes you question
Right.
how much did all that affect the investigation? Did Henrik's case get the attention it deserved, or did it just get lost in the enormity of what was happening?
Exactly. So let's go to the crime scene. This is Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. Even back then, it was known for its high crime rates.
Oh, yeah.
And because of 9/11, the investigation was super limited. They only had one detective and what they call an evidence collection officer.
There's a difference, right? Like an evidence collection officer, they're trained to document and collect evidence, but they don't have the same authority as a detective.
Right.
So not having a full team, especially those forensic specialists, that's a huge disadvantage.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. And from what Prate and Joyce said, that was pretty common that day.
Huh?
Resources were just spread so thin.
So the police initially thought it might have been a robbery. The 911 call mentions some kind of argument, possibly about money. But get this. Lucina says Henrik only had $5 on him that night. He sent almost everything else back home, remember?
That's a crucial detail. It would seem to rule out robbery, right?
You'd think so.
But you have to consider it's not always about how much the victim actually has. It's about what the attacker thinks. If they thought Henrik had money, that could have been enough to start a confrontation.
It's true. There's also this other layer makes things even more complicated. Henrik had just started this new job, working the night shift at a supermarket in Brooklyn, but he wasn't familiar with the area at all, and he ended up getting off the subway at the wrong stop.
Oh, no.
So picture this. He's alone, it's nighttime, he's in a dangerous neighborhood that he doesn't know, and it's one of the most terrifying days in American history.
So he's a victim of circumstance, potentially.
It's possible. Lost, disoriented, wrong place at the absolute worst possible time.
It's just tragic.
There's one more thing I gotta mention. That night, Henrik was wearing a camouflage jacket. With tensions so high after 9/11 and, his limited English and his appearance, some people think he might have been mistaken for someone of Middle Eastern descent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, targeted in a hate crime.
That's definitely a theory that makes you think. It speaks to the fear and suspicion after 9/11
No.
and how easily prejudice can turn violent.
Right.
Now, the detectives, they weren't totally convinced about this theory, but you can't ignore it completely, can you?
No. And then years later, the NYPD's cold case squad, they picked up Henrik's case. They used this, well, it's pretty amazing technology. They basically rebuilt the neighborhood digitally, to try and find anyone who might have been around that night.
Wow. How does that even work?
They use old city records, satellite images, even weather data, all kinds of things. They're trying to recreate the scene as accurately as possible.
So they can pinpoint potential witnesses.
Exactly. We're talking hundreds of people they contacted, just trying to piece together what happened.
That technology is incredible. It's a game changer for cold cases, for sure.
It really is. It's like they're building a time machine to go back and find those missing pieces.
Yeah. But unfortunately, even with all that effort, they still haven't found any definitive answers for Henrik's case.
It's kind of crazy, right? Like all the chaos that day just created this situation where Henrik's case could get overlooked. Makes you wonder how many other stories got lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a sad thought, really. So many families, maybe, still looking for answers. Their loved one's case is overshadowed by everything else going on.
But even after all this time, Lucina hasn't given up hope. She really believes that someone out there, somewhere, knows something, saw something that night, something that could finally crack this case wide open.
That's where, the power of community comes in, I think. It might just take one person, one little detail, and boom, case solved.
Exactly. And that's where you come in. You've heard all this, right? All these details, all the twists and turns. Maybe something clicked for you.
Yeah.
Maybe you were living in that area back then.
Yeah.
Or knew someone who did. Maybe something we talked about, some tiny thing, sparked a memory for you. Doesn't matter how small.
Right.
If anything at all resonates with you, even if it seems insignificant, please reach out to the authorities. Whatever you know. It could be the missing piece, the one that brings Henrik's family some peace and finally solves this case.
And after all these years, think about it. You could be the one to help bring justice for Henrik. One phone call, one email, one little tip, and everything changes.
It's important to remember that time doesn't diminish the value of a life lost. Every victim, they deserve justice, no matter how much time has passed.
That's right. And by keeping Henrik's story alive, like we're doing now, sharing it, encouraging people to speak up, we're doing our part, I think. Not just for him, but for everyone whose case is still unsolved.
What strikes me, I guess, is how this whole story, it shows us that justice, it's not just this legal thing, it's human.
Yeah.
It's about empathy, compassion, recognizing that every life matters.
And that's why storytelling is so crucial. We share Henrik's story, dig into these details, we make sure he's not forgotten, we keep that hope for justice alive.
So we got to ask you this. What does it really mean to find justice for victims like Henrik, especially when their stories get, overshadowed by events like 9/11?
It's a good question.
Is it about finding who did it, making them pay for what they did? Is it about giving answers to a grieving family? Or is it something more?
It's hard to say. Is it about really recognizing that every life has value, remembering their stories, making sure those memories are honored, not just on anniversaries, but every day?
I don't know. This whole deep dive's been quite a journey. We started with a simple question, right? Who killed Henrik Sevak? But now it's bigger than that. It's about human nature, hope, how huge events can change individual lives. It's a lot to process.
It is. But we've seen how one man's story, as tragic as it is, can teach us so much.
Yeah.
About family, about striving for something better, about never giving up on the truth no matter what.
We can't bring Henrik back, but we can honor him by keeping his story alive, by searching for answers, by working together so everyone can get justice no matter what.
Yeah. And maybe, just maybe, by talking about this, by encouraging people to think, to reflect, we can create a better future. A world where tragedies like Henrik's don't get forgotten, but actually push us to make positive changes. A more understanding, more compassionate world.
Thank you, really, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a new way to look at this story, a story you might not have known about before.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's inspired you to think about, memory, community, how important it is to seek justice, even when things seem impossible.
Right.
Every voice matters. Every story needs to be heard. And every act of kindness, no matter how small, it can make a difference, really. It's funny. We started off wanting to know who killed Henrik Sevak,
Oh,
and we've learned so much about him, the investigation, how crazy things were that day. But it feels like the real question now is, what does his story tell us? About justice, about remembering, especially with something as huge as 9/11.
yeah. It's like a reminder that these individual stories, they can get lost when something big happens. But every story is a life, a family that's hurting, and they deserve to know the truth.
And it's just like you said before, it doesn't matter how much time goes by, Henrik's family, they still deserve answers, just like any other family who lost someone, that day or any day.
Exactly. That's why we got to keep talking about this. Keep Henrik's story alive. Let people know that even the smallest detail, it could be what breaks the case.
We've gone over a lot, haven't we? The chaos of 9/11, those premonitions, all that technology they're using now to solve cold cases. But at the end of the day, it comes down to people. Someone knows something, and that's pretty powerful if you think about it.
It really shows how much we need each other. It's
Yeah.
on all of us to look out for each other, to seek justice, not just for Henrik, but for everyone.
Doing this deep dive, it's really opened my eyes. Justice isn't just an ending, it's a process. Sometimes it's messy, you have to dig deep, ask hard questions, and never lose hope.
Yeah. It's about remembering. It's about finding the truth and recognizing that every single life matters. And maybe by sharing Henrik's story, maybe we can give his family a little bit of peace after all this time.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Hopefully, it's giving you a different way to look at Henrik's story, this story you might not have heard before. And maybe it'll make you think about memory, community, fighting for justice, even when it seems impossible.
That's what it's all about.
Every voice matters, right?
Right.
Every story deserves to be heard. And every act of kindness, no matter how small, can make a difference. That's the truth.